This is the story of the Battle of Aschaffenburg, where a German major named Emil Lamberth hanged two of his own officers to force a medieval city to fight to the last man, and how American forces responded with 10 days of the most destructive urban combat in the final weeks of World War II. What you've read on the internet about this battle is partly true and partly myth, and this video separates the documented facts from the sensationalized accounts that have spread online. Before we go any further, we need to correct the most basic error that's been repeated across dozens of websites and YouTube videos. The German commander's name was not Emil Lambert, it was Emil Lamberth, spelled Lamberth. This seemingly small mistake has been copied and pasted so many times that people now accept it as fact. But German court records from his 1949 trial confirm the correct spelling. When you can't even get the commander's name right, that's your first clue that much of what's been written about Aschaffenburg needs serious verification. The second major myth we need to address right now is the image of civilians hanging from lampposts throughout the city, which has become the defining visual of the Battle of Aschaffenburg in popular retellings. The truth, documented in contemporary American government sources and German court records, is more specific and arguably more disturbing. Secretary of War Henry Stimson gave a press conference on the 7th of April, 1945, just 4 days after the battle ended, and he stated clearly that there were 2 hangings in Aschaffenburg, and both victims were German military officers. Not dozens of civilians, not women and children strung up to terrorize the population, but 2 Wehrmacht officers executed by their own commander for wanting to survive the war's final weeks. This video tells you what actually happened in Aschaffenburg based on military records, German court documents, eyewitness accounts, and academic research. We'll examine Major Lamberth's background and forces, the truth about those executions, the American assault that destroyed 70% of the city, and why this battle happened at all when Germany's defeat was obvious to everyone. Let's start with the question of why any German commander was still fighting in late March 1945. Why cities still fought in March 1945. By March 1945, World War II in Europe was effectively over. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, Soviet forces were driving toward Berlin from the east, and every rational military assessment said Germany had lost. Yet certain cities fought with shocking intensity while others surrendered without resistance, and Aschaffenburg fell into the first category. Understanding why requires understanding Adolf Hitler's Festungsstadt orders. Festungsstadt translates to fortress city, and these were cities Hitler personally designated as strongpoints that must be defended to the last man, regardless of military logic. The designation placed the local commander under Hitler's direct authority, bypassing the normal chain of command, but more importantly, it meant an SS delegation would arrive to monitor compliance with Hitler's orders. This is critical to understanding what happened in Aschaffenburg, because Major Lamberth was not acting in a vacuum. He had SS officers literally watching him to ensure he enforced total resistance. Hitler issued these fortress city orders as his empire collapsed around him, believing that fanatical resistance would buy time for his mythical wonder weapons to turn the tide or force the Western Allies to negotiate rather than fight for every German city. The reality was simpler and more brutal because these orders existed because Hitler and the Nazi leadership knew that given a choice, most German commanders would surrender rather than see their hometowns destroyed and their men killed in a lost cause. Aschaffenburg received its fortress city designation on the 5th of March 1945. The city sits on the main river in Bavaria, about 25 miles southeast of Frankfurt, and it had strategic value as a communications hub and barrier to American advances toward Nuremberg and Munich. But its real importance to Hitler was psychological, because if Aschaffenburg fought, it might inspire other cities to resist, but if it surrendered, it would prove that German will had collapsed. The fortress city order put Major Emil Lamberth in an impossible position, which brings us to who this man actually was. Popular accounts describe Lamberth as a fanatical Nazi major who eagerly embraced Hitler's last stand orders, but the documented facts present a more complicated picture. Emil Lamberth was a World War I veteran who had maintained his reserve commission with the Wehrmacht while working as a schoolteacher, and he was not SS, he was not a Nazi Party official, but rather a Wehrmacht engineer officer who commanded the 9th Pioneer Replacement and Training Battalion before being sworn in as Kampfkommandant, or combat commander, of Aschaffenburg on the 5th of March 1945. Being a Wehrmacht officer rather than SS matters for understanding what happened next, because Wehrmacht officers were professional soldiers bound by military law and tradition who could be court-martialed for disobeying orders. When Hitler designated Aschaffenburg a fortress city with an SS delegation arriving to monitor compliance, Lamberth had three choices: obey the orders and fight, refuse and be executed for treason, or surrender the city and face the same fate. This doesn't excuse his actions, but it explains the pressure he operated under. The forces Lamberth commanded were a motley collection typical of Germany's final weeks. He had approximately 5,000 to 8,500 defenders, though exact numbers vary by source, and the corps consisted of replacement troops from his own training battalion, convalescent soldiers pulled from hospitals, and remnants of the 36th Volkssturm Division that had been shattered in earlier fighting. He also had 7 companies of Volkssturm militia, which we'll discuss in detail later, and 200 to 300 officer candidates aged 17 to 18 from training courses designated Lehrgang 27/28. Equipment was severely limited, according to Major Quentin Schiller's 1,989 thesis for the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the most academically rigorous study of this battle. Lamberth's entire force had only 32 machine guns. That's for over 5,000 defenders trying to hold a city, and they had rifles, some mortars, a handful of anti-tank weapons, and desperation. Lamberth did have advantages in terrain and fortifications. Aschaffenburg's location on the main river provided a natural obstacle. The wooded Spessart foothills offered defensive positions, and the city contained 5 major Kaserne complexes, essentially fortified barracks that could be turned into strong points. Most importantly, he had Schloss Johannisburg, a 17th-century Renaissance castle that dominated the city center and would become his final headquarters. But terrain and castles don't win battles when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and defending a lost cause. Lamberth needed his defenders, both military and civilian, to believe surrender meant death at the hands of the advancing Americans, or that some miracle would save Germany. To create that belief, he needed to demonstrate what happened to anyone who showed weakness. That's where the hangings come in. Let's be precise about what happened, because this is where internet accounts diverge most dramatically from documented history. There were 2 confirmed executions in Aschaffenburg during the battle. Both victims were German military officers. Both were hanged after courts-martial. Both hangings were public and meant to terrify the population into compliance. And both were specifically cited by Secretary of War Stimson in his April 7th press conference as evidence of Nazi fanaticism forcing Germans to continue fighting. The first and best documented victim was Lieutenant Friedel Haymann, a wounded officer with valid hospital papers who had just married 5 days before his execution. On March 26, he was arrested for failing to register with the local military command and allegedly possessing an English-language sign. And that sign, which may have been intended for surrender purposes, became the excuse for charging him with defeatism and treason. Haymann's court-martial was a formality. On the 28th of March 1945, he was taken to Café Höfling on Herstallstrasse, and Major Lamberth personally presided over the execution. According to eyewitness accounts and German court testimony from Lamberth's 1949 trial, Lamberth stripped Haymann of his insignia, his Iron Cross, and his wound badge before the hanging. And this ritual humiliation was intentional because Lamberth wanted everyone watching to understand that military honor meant nothing if you showed weakness. After the hanging, a sign reading, "Cowards and traitors hang," was placed on Haymann's body, and his corpse was left on display. This wasn't summary execution in the heat of combat, but calculated terror performed in public with all the ceremony of official justice. An elderly German woman named Irmis Eberth, who was 87 years old when interviewed by Süddeutsche Zeitung newspaper in 2015, remembered her father coming home that day. She recalled him saying, "He came back pale and told us they had hanged an officer in her Stahlstrasse." Lamberth screamed and shouted. Many people stood around. The execution succeeded in its immediate goal because the people of Aschaffenburg understood that surrender attempts meant death. The second victim was an unnamed Luftwaffe officer, and less documentation exists about this execution, but multiple sources confirm it happened. This officer reportedly told Lamberth he had no skills that could contribute to the city's defense, and that admission cost him his life. Like Haman, he was court-martialed and hanged. 2 executions. That's what Secretary Stimson confirmed in his contemporary press conference. That's what German court records documented, and that's what Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the American officer who accepted Lamberth's surrender, personally witnessed when he entered the city. Sparks saw Haman's body still hanging. So, where did the image of mass civilian hangings come from? Likely from a combination of factors, starting with the fact that these executions were genuinely shocking and memorable to American soldiers who witnessed the aftermath. When you find a friendly officer hanging from a rope with a sign calling him a coward, that image burns into memory, and post-war accounts emphasized Nazi brutality, which meant mass executions were common enough elsewhere that people assumed Aschaffenburg followed the same pattern. Third, and most significantly, eyewitness accounts from traumatic events often conflate multiple scenes or amplify details in memory over decades. The truth that 2 German officers were hanged for wanting to survive is actually more disturbing than the myth of mass civilian terror, because it reveals how Nazi Germany consumed its own defenders in its final weeks. These weren't executions of resistance fighters or civilians accused of aiding the enemy, but German soldiers killed by German commanders for the crime of recognizing reality. By the 28th of March, 1945, when Lieutenant Haman died, American forces were already approaching the city. Let's look at who they were and what they brought with them. The 45th Infantry Division arrives. The American force that would destroy 70% of Aschaffenburg was the 45th Infantry Division, a unit with a distinguished combat record stretching from Sicily through southern France and into Germany. By March 1945, these men were veterans of nearly 2 years of continuous combat who'd seen it all: amphibious assaults, mountain warfare, urban fighting, and the liberation of Dachau concentration camp, which was still a month in their future, but would become the 45th Division's most famous action. The division commander was Major General Robert T. Frederick, though the actual tactical fighting would fall to his regimental and battalion commanders. 3 regiments composed the 45th Division: the 157th, 179th, and 180th Infantry Regiments, and all 3 would be committed to Aschaffenburg, with the 157th Regiment under Colonel Walter P. O'Brien, conducting the primary assault into the city itself. Within the 157th Regiment, the officer who would personally accept Major Lamberth's surrender was Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 3rd Battalion. Sparks is a significant figure in World War II history because a few weeks after Aschaffenburg, his battalion would liberate Dachau, where Sparks would stop American soldiers from massacring SS guards in revenge for what they found. His leadership at Aschaffenburg and later at Dachau showed both the capacity for overwhelming violence when necessary and the discipline to control that violence when appropriate. The 45th Division didn't fight alone. Supporting them was an artillery array that would reduce much of Aschaffenburg to rubble, starting with the 158th Field Artillery Battalion, providing 105 mm howitzer support, the 189th Field Artillery Battalion bringing 155 mm guns, and Company C of the 2nd Chemical Mortar Battalion adding 4.2-inch mortars firing white phosphorus rounds. 5 additional corps-level artillery battalions joined the bombardment, including 8-inch howitzers. And here's where we can confirm one specific claim from popular accounts. The 45th Division did employ M12 self-propelled 155mm howitzers, commonly called Long Toms, and 2 of these massive guns were brought up to fire directly into the Pioneer Kaserne, one of the fortified barracks complexes, at essentially point-blank range. They fired over 100 rounds into that single target, so when people talk about the Long Tom barrage that leveled Aschaffenburg, this is the documented basis for that claim. Air support came from P-47 Thunderbolts, the workhorses of American tactical aviation, carrying napalm, rockets, and machine guns for strafing runs. The combination of artillery, mortars, airstrikes, and direct fire from tank destroyers and self-propelled guns gave the Americans overwhelming firepower, which meant the question wasn't whether they could destroy Aschaffenburg, but how much destruction would be necessary before Lambert surrendered. Initial contact came on the 25th of March, 1945, when Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, part of George Patton's Third Army, approached the city. They captured the Nilkheim Railroad Bridge intact, which should have allowed quick entry into Aschaffenburg, but the infamous Hammerberg raid intervened. Patton diverted forces to attempt rescuing Allied prisoners of war from a camp near Hammerberg, including his son-in-law, and the raid was a disaster that cost hundreds of American casualties and accomplished nothing. More relevant to Aschaffenburg, it pulled away the 4th Armored Division just as they were positioned to take the city quickly, and the delay gave Lamberth time to organize his defense and execute Lieutenant Hayman to intimidate potential defectors. By March 26, command boundaries shifted. Aschaffenburg transferred from 3rd Army to 7th Army's XV Corps, and the 45th Infantry Division drew the mission of taking the city. Unlike the highly mobile 4th Armored Division, infantry divisions were organized and trained for exactly this kind of grinding urban combat, which meant the Americans would get their fortress battle after all. On March 27, the 157th Regiment's 3rd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, crossed the main river, and they immediately encountered intense resistance. What followed was 10 days of the kind of fighting that destroys cities and breaks units. The battle, 10 days of urban destruction. Urban combat is uniquely brutal. Every building becomes a potential fortress, every window might hide a sniper, and every street corner could be pre-targeted by mortar or anti-tank weapons. Attackers must advance through this environment, while defenders, knowing the terrain intimately, can retreat from one strong point to another, forcing the attackers to repeat the process endlessly, and the advantage lies entirely with the defense, until the attacker brings enough firepower to simply obliterate each defensive position. That's what happened in Aschaffenburg. The Americans didn't try to fight fair or minimize collateral damage, but instead identified a defended building, called in artillery or airstrikes, reduced it to rubble, and moved forward. Repeat 1,000 times over 10 days. The battle began in earnest on March 28 inches, the Schweinheim district, which is the same day Lieutenant Hayman was hanged. As American soldiers fought house to house through Schweinheim, Lamberth was across the city demonstrating what happened to Germans who wanted to surrender, and the message was clear to his defenders. The only choice was fighting or dying. German tactics focused on ambush and delay. They'd allow American infantry to enter a street, then open fire from multiple directions, and riflemen. Harry Eisner of the 157th Regiment described one incident where civilians on a train overpass smiled and waved at advancing Americans, then immediately directed mortar fire onto their positions. Whether these were actual civilians or Volkssturm militia in civilian clothes remains unclear. But the psychological impact was significant because American soldiers learned to trust nothing and no one. Another incident Eisner documented involved roughly 100 German civilians attempting to flee the city. They came over a hill directly into German rifle fire, and Eisner witnessed German troops deliberately shooting their own people, including a young girl with a stomach wound. This wasn't Lamberth's forces preventing surrender, but the reality of Nazi Germany in collapse, where those trying to escape the fighting were shot as traitors. By March 31, the Americans had fought their way close enough to Schloss Johannisburg for Captain Anseth's Spears to fly over the castle and drop a surrender ultimatum. The message stated that the Americans would level the town if the Germans continued the fight, and this is the documented basis for claims that the Americans ordered the city leveled or erased. It was a conditional threat meant to compel surrender, not a punitive order to destroy the city regardless, and it represented standard military practice when facing fanatical resistance. Lamberth ignored the ultimatum. The fighting continued. The 5 caserne complexes became focal points of the battle: the Artillery Caserne, Pioneer Caserne, Bois Brule Caserne, Lagarde Caserne, and Jaeger Caserne. Each was a substantial military installation with thick walls, multiple buildings, and prepared defensive positions, and American forces couldn't simply bypass them because defenders in the casernes would attack from behind. Each had to be reduced individually. This is where the M12 self-propelled 155mm howitzers earned their reputation. Brought up to fire at targets they could literally see, these guns demolished fortified positions that indirect artillery fire might not penetrate, and the Pioneer Caserne, where Lamberth's engineer troops were concentrated, received particular attention. Over 100 rounds of 155mm direct fire blasted through its walls until organized resistance collapsed. White phosphorus proved equally devastating. The Chemical Mortar Battalion's 4.2-inch mortars fired white phosphorus rounds that started fires throughout the city, and white phosphorus ignites on contact with oxygen and burns at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It's nearly impossible to extinguish, and the smoke it generates is toxic, which meant buildings hit with white phosphorus didn't just burn but were consumed. The fires spread to neighboring structures, creating conflagrations that destroyed entire blocks. By April 2, organized German resistance effectively ended. American forces had captured over 1,100 prisoners that day alone. The city was in ruins, fires burned out of control, and most of Lamberth's defenders were dead, wounded, or captured. But Lamberth himself held out in Schloss Johannisburg with a final group of holdouts. The next morning, April 3, at 9 o'clock, Major Emil Lamberth finally surrendered. The surrender at Schloss Johannisburg. Schloss Johannisburg had served as German headquarters throughout the battle. The castle's Renaissance architecture, built between 1605 and 1614, made it the most prominent structure in Aschaffenburg, and its towers gave sentries clear views across the entire city, allowing German observers to direct artillery and mortar fire onto American positions. Consequently, American artillery had repeatedly hit the castle throughout the battle, and white phosphorus rounds started fires that spread through sections of the structure. On the morning of April 3, with most of the city already in American hands, Lamberth sent out a Volkssturm officer accompanied by a captured American soldier to seek terms. Colonel O'Brien, commanding the 157th Regiment, responded that only unconditional surrender was acceptable, and Lamberth had until 8 o'clock that morning to comply. Lamberth agreed, but insisted on surrendering to an officer of equal or higher rank, following the Wehrmacht tradition, where surrender carried somewhat less dishonor if rendered to a peer rather than a junior officer. O'Brien sent Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, the closest available officer of sufficient rank, and Sparks drove his jeep to the castle entrance at 9 o'clock, 1 hour after the deadline. Sparks' account of the surrender is matter of fact. This major gave an order, and all of his officers came out of the building single file. They took off their pistol belts and dropped them at my feet. No drama, no defiant last stands, just defeated men acknowledging reality that should have been obvious weeks earlier. Lamberth then rode with Sparks in his jeep around Aschaffenburg, pointing out remaining strongpoints and ordering their surrender, and white flags were hung from Schloss Johannisburg's damaged towers. The Battle of Aschaffenburg was over. The final casualty count shows the battle's intensity. American forces suffered approximately 20 killed and 300 wounded, which are remarkably light casualties for 10 days of urban combat, reflecting the Americans' willingness to use firepower rather than infantry assaults where possible. German defenders lost roughly 1,600, killed or wounded with 3,500 taken prisoner, and total German forces, at the battle's start, ranged from 5,000 to 8,500 depending on the source, meaning German casualties approached or exceeded 50%. Civilian casualties remain undocumented, and this is a significant gap in the historical record. We know approximately 3,000 civilians remained in Aschaffenburg during the battle. We know medical personnel treated civilian wounded, but no comprehensive count exists of civilian deaths. Given that 70% of the city was destroyed and fighting raged for 10 days, civilian casualties were certainly substantial, though the fact that no one recorded exact numbers reflects the chaos of Germany's collapse and perhaps a reluctance to document the full cost. The 70% destruction figure appears consistently across American, German, and academic sources. Schweinheim suffered near-total destruction from house-to-house fighting. The 5 Kaserne complexes were reduced to rubble, and entire neighborhoods burned after white phosphorus strikes. The 157th Regiment's history described Aschaffenburg as pounded to rubble, though 30% of structures did survive. Schloss Johannisburg itself was heavily damaged but not destroyed. According to German sources, it was completely restored several years later, though the restoration likely took most of the 1,950 seconds, and today the castle houses museums and city offices with a memorial plaque to Lieutenant Hayman at the site of his execution on Herstelstrasse. Now we need to address the controversial question of civilian participation in the battle. The Volkssturm question, militia or civilians? One of the most repeated claims about Aschaffenburg is that Major Lamberth forced women and children to fight or turned civilians into combatants, and this requires careful examination because it mixes documented facts with significant exaggerations. The Volkssturm was Nazi Germany's last-ditch militia, officially established in October 1944, and the name translates roughly as People's Storm, and was intended to evoke the mass uprising against Napoleon in 1813. The reality was far less inspiring, because Volkssturm conscripted all males aged 16 to 60. Not already serving in the military, they received minimal training, often just hours or days, and were equipped with whatever weapons remained available, typically obsolete rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Aschaffenburg's Volkssturm consisted of 7 companies organized as Battalion 15/1, mustered on the 12th of November, 1944, and these men were part of Lamberth's defensive forces throughout the battle. Here's the critical point. Volkssturm wore uniforms or, at minimum, identifying armbands, which meant they were officially recognized combatants under military law, even if barely trained and poorly equipped. The problem for American soldiers was that Volkssturm uniforms were often incomplete or makeshift. A 60-year-old shopkeeper issued a rifle, and an armband is technically a soldier, but he looks like a civilian with a gun, and in the confusion and terror of urban combat, American troops encountering Volkssturm likely perceived them as civilians forced to fight, rather than recognizing them as officially mobilized militia. Some documented incidents go beyond Volkssturm. Rifleman Eisner's account of civilians on a train overpass directing mortar fire suggests active participation by people not in military service, and German sources, including the German Wikipedia article citing local histories, mention old men, women, and young girls throwing grenades from rooftops. However, Dr. Alois Stadtmüller, a German local historian, disputed these claims, arguing Americans confused dust-covered Volkssturm with civilians. The truth likely lies somewhere between American accounts and German denials. Some civilian participation probably occurred, particularly in support roles like spotting, carrying supplies, tending wounded, and serving as messengers, and the city leadership had issued an evacuation order stating anyone remaining would be expected to take up arms or assist in the fight. This created ambiguity between combatant and non-combatant that both sides could interpret differently. Whether any women or children actually engaged in direct combat remains unverified in primary sources. The Volkssturm was male only, so women and children could have participated in support roles or as individual cases of desperate resistance. But the image of organized units of women and children manning machine guns appears to be an exaggeration. What is documented is that approximately 3,000 civilians remained in Aschaffenburg during the battle, and they were trapped between German forces, preventing retreat, and American forces destroying the city. Some undoubtedly assisted the defense voluntarily out of fear, coercion, or genuine belief in Nazi ideology, while others simply tried to survive in cellars while the city burned around them. The distinction matters for understanding what happened and avoiding sensationalized accounts. The Volkssturm were military combatants, however ineffective, and support roles like spotting or carrying supplies while making civilians participants in the battle didn't turn them into soldiers. Outright fabrications about child soldiers manning defensive positions serve only to obscure the reality of what urban warfare does to civilian populations. Speaking of reality versus myth, let's address the claim that American forces stopped playing by the rules. Did the Americans stop playing by the rules? This phrase appears in numerous retellings of Aschaffenburg's battle, often accompanied by the implication that discovering Lieutenant Hayman's hanging body and encountering civilian spotters caused American forces to abandon restraint and deliberately target non-combatants or adopt prohibited tactics. We need to examine what actually changed, if anything. No documented formal change in rules of engagement has been found in 45th Division records. What the Americans did at Aschaffenburg was employ maximum combined arms firepower to reduce a defended city with minimum risk to their own troops. And this was standard American doctrine for urban combat in 1945. The U.S. Army had learned brutal lessons about house-to-house fighting, most famously at the Battle of Manila in February and March 1945, which occurred simultaneously with Aschaffenburg, and American doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower precisely to avoid the casualties that came from infantry assaults against prepared defenses. If artillery could destroy a building, you used artillery. And if airstrikes could blast an enemy position, you called in P-47 seconds. This wasn't barbarism, but pragmatism. Did American soldiers become less willing to take risks to spare civilian lives after discovering Hayman's body and experiencing ambushes from apparent non-combatants? Almost certainly yes, because combat soldiers make split-second decisions based on perceived threats. When you've found a German officer hanged by his own side for wanting to surrender, and when people you thought were civilians direct mortar fire onto your position, you stop giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. But this was individual soldier behavior, not commanded policy. The April 31 ultimatum to level the town if resistance continued was standard military practice, not a war crime. Commanders regularly offered defenders the chance to surrender before initiating final assaults, and the threat of destruction served as both inducement to surrender and legal cover, establishing that defenders had been warned. Nearly every major city assault in World War II included such ultimatums. The reality is that American forces at Aschaffenburg fought exactly the way they'd been trained and equipped to fight. They used artillery in quantities that European armies found shocking throughout World War II. They employed white phosphorus, napalm, and direct fire from self-propelled guns, and they bombed and burned their way through the city systematically. This was American combined arms doctrine, proven from North Africa through Italy and France into Germany itself. What made Aschaffenburg notable wasn't that Americans used excessive force, but that Major Lamberth refused to surrender a militarily useless city, forcing the Americans to apply that standard doctrine for 10 days until 70% of the city was destroyed. The responsibility for Aschaffenburg's destruction lies with the decision to defend it, not with the methods used to overcome that defense. This brings us to the final question. Why did this battle happen at all? Why Aschaffenburg fought when Germany was defeated? Major Emil Lamberth's decision to defend Aschaffenburg has been characterized as fanaticism, loyalty to Hitler, or Nazi zealotry. But German courts in 1949 presented a different explanation. When Lamberth was tried for the manslaughter of Lieutenant Hayman, the court found him guilty but acknowledged he acted under extreme pressure from SS officials monitoring his compliance with Hitler's Fortress City orders. The 1,949 trial resulted in a 4-year sentence, later pardoned in 1950 with the sentence reduced. And the court noted that Lamberth was reportedly intoxicated when he condemned Hayman, though this hardly excuses the act. More significantly, the court recognized that refusing Hitler's direct orders meant Lamberth's own execution. So was Lamberth a fanatical Nazi, or a professional soldier caught in an impossible situation? American sources uniformly describe him as fanatical, while German post-war sources emphasize the pressure he faced, and both are probably partly true. A Wehrmacht engineer officer who'd worked as a schoolteacher was neither an SS true believer nor a man who would have chosen this battle if given a real choice. But individual psychology matters less than the system that created the situation. Hitler's Fortress City orders were designed specifically to prevent rational surrender decisions, and by placing commanders under his direct authority with SS oversight, Hitler removed the military chain of command that might have counseled withdrawal. By executing officers who showed weakness, he created an environment where the safest personal choice was fighting to the end, regardless of strategic logic. Aschaffenburg's defensive terrain made it a plausible strong point. The main river, the fortified casernes, Schloss Johannisburg, and the Spessart foothills provided real military advantages, and the city sat astride American supply lines and communications routes. If Lamberth could delay the Americans for weeks, that might matter in some larger strategic context, though of course by March 1945 there was no larger strategic context because Germany had lost and everyone knew it. But the Fortress City system didn't allow for that acknowledgement. Secretary Stimson's April 7 press conference specifically cited the 2 hangings as evidence that Nazis were compelling Germans to fight through terror. Stimson recognized that most Germans by this point wanted to surrender but couldn't because Nazi Party officials and SS enforcers would kill them first, and Aschaffenburg exemplified this dynamic perfectly. 2 officers who recognized the war was lost were hanged as examples, and the remaining defenders, military and Volkssturm alike, understood they would die whether they fought the Americans or refused to fight their own commanders. Aschaffenburg wasn't unique. Heilbronn fought from April 4 to April 12 with similar intensity. Nuremberg's battle lasted 5 days in mid-April, and Fortress City orders created these last stands across Germany in March and April 1945. What made Aschaffenburg notable was the combination of factors: a charismatic commander willing to execute his own men, substantial defensive terrain, a 10-day battle length that gave it narrative structure, and the American 45th Division's documented combat operations providing detailed records. The battle also received attention because Felix Sparks, who accepted Lamberth's surrender, later became a prominent figure in Holocaust education and 45th Division veteran affairs. His accounts of Aschaffenburg and Dachau kept both battles in historical memory, and without Sparks' memoirs and interviews, Aschaffenburg might have faded into obscurity like dozens of other German city battles in 1945. Instead, it became an internet legend, which brings us full circle to why we needed this video. The story of Aschaffenburg has been told and retold online until fact and fiction blur together. Mass civilian hangings that never happened, a commander named Lambert instead of Lamberth, children and women forced into combat units that didn't exist, American forces abandoning rules of engagement they never actually violated. These myths make the story more dramatic, but they obscure something more important. The documented truth is chilling enough. A Wehrmacht officer who was probably a decent man in peacetime found himself trapped by a totalitarian system that demanded he fight a battle everyone knew was lost, and to enforce that demand, he hanged 2 of his own officers after mock trials, leaving their bodies on display as warnings. He conscripted teenagers and old men into a defense that would kill or wound half his force. He kept 3,000 civilians in a city that would be 70% destroyed. And he did all this knowing Germany had already lost the war. Lieutenant Friedel Haymann died 5 days after his wedding because he possessed a sign that might have been used to surrender. An unnamed Luftwaffe officer died because he admitted he had no skills to contribute to a meaningless battle. And these weren't partisans or resistance fighters, but German soldiers executed by German commanders for the crime of wanting to survive. The Americans who fought for Aschaffenburg weren't motivated by revenge for the hangings or by hatred of civilians, but were professional soldiers following doctrine designed to minimize their own casualties while accomplishing their mission. The destruction of 70% of the city was the predictable result of determined defense meeting overwhelming firepower, and 20 American dead and 300 wounded. For 10 days of urban combat shows remarkable fire discipline and tactical skill, not bloodlust. The Volkssturm who fought in Aschaffenburg weren't fanatics volunteering for suicide missions, but shopkeepers and factory workers and farmers given rifles and told they'd be shot if they didn't fight. Some probably believed in defending Germany, while most probably just wanted to survive, but understood that refusing to fight meant certain death from their own side, while fighting at least offered a chance at survival if the Americans took prisoners. The civilians trapped in Aschaffenburg weren't collaborators who deserved what happened to them, but ordinary people caught between armies, unable to flee because German forces would shoot them as defectors, unable to surrender because American artillery didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in a defended city, and unable to do anything except hide in cellars and hope they'd survive. This is what total war looks like in its final stages. A medieval city reduced to rubble, thousands of casualties for no strategic purpose, officers hanging from ropes for wanting peace, teenagers with rifles fighting veteran infantry divisions, and all of it documented in military records that have been available for decades, but keep getting overwritten by dramatic retellings that invent details to make the story more cinematic. The Battle of Aschaffenburg matters not because it was uniquely brutal, but because it was typical of Nazi Germany's final collapse. Dozens of cities fought similar battles in March and April, 1,945. Thousands of Germans were executed by their own side for defeatism, and hundreds of thousands died in battles that changed nothing strategically. The war ended with Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April 1945, less than a month after Lambert surrendered Schloss Johannisburg, which means everything that happened in Aschaffenburg was meaningless except to the people who died there. Major Emil Lamberth served 4 years in German prison, was pardoned, and disappeared from historical records. We don't know when he died or how he lived with executing 2 men for wanting peace, while Lieutenant Friedel Haymann has a memorial plaque at the site of his execution, and his story is remembered, at least by the people of Aschaffenburg. The unnamed Luftwaffe officer who admitted he had no skills to contribute is forgotten entirely, and hundreds of German soldiers and an unknown number of civilians died in a battle that had already been lost. If you want to understand World War II's final weeks, forget the myths about Aschaffenburg. Read the military records, read Secretary Stimson's press conference, read the German court documents from Lamberth's trial, and read Felix Sparks's memoirs, because the documented history tells you everything you need to know about what happens when totalitarian systems collide with military reality. Major Emil Lamberth hanged 2 of his own officers to force a medieval city to fight for 10 days in a war that everyone knew was over. American forces responded by destroying 70% of the city because that's what urban combat requires when defenders refuse to surrender. That's the story of the Battle of Aschaffenburg, and no embellishment necessary.